All right, continuing on topics of test design. This is one that's really popular these days. Agile story acceptance tests. These are often called just story tests or perhaps fit criterion. They are, however, tied to requirements and they are acceptance tests. Now, in Agile development, a lot of companies choose to manage their requirements in what they call a backlog. It's a prioritized list of requirements, and each entry in the requirement is described very often using the style of a user story. It's the relationship between a user and a system in order to get something accomplished, which is of value to the user. User stories are gaining popularity in product development and even in information technology systems, such as infrastructure systems and banks and insurance companies. A very, very large story is sometimes called an epic, and it's split into smaller stories to get things done in practical increments of work. So when we're talking about story acceptance tests, we're talking about a certain type of requirement that's defined as a user story, and this is the acceptance criterion. Story tests, so that's what I will call them, story tests, are not things that the team or an individual actually makes up. Story tests are elicited from customers. They're often in the form of an example. So there would be a clear example of how we expect the system to behave in certain circumstances. Story tests are used in Agile teams to confirm implementation. Indeed, they're not just used to confirm implementation when we implement the story the first time, but they're very often used for future automated regression tests. So every time we do a build, many times we'd like to repeat the tests, and we'll repeat the story tests by automating them, and they're basically going to give us transactional regression confidence. So if you have 1,000 stories, you'll have way over 1,000 story tests that you'll be able to run, and this will regress your application from a transactional perspective, which means that if we accidentally inject a bug into an existing story, we should be able to find it relatively quickly with this type of automation. So also, story tests are used at the end of an increment of development to demonstrate that the story was implemented correctly. We will show our stakeholders, here's the application running, look, it passes these story tests. So story tests are actually both part of software requirements and part of the work done to do acceptance testing and a strong basis for automated regression testing of the transactions. So there's got 3 places in software engineering, a very useful thing to focus on, good, healthy story tests. Now, what's a story? Well, a user story are written by the business or the customer. It's a requirement, and they describe in 2 or 3 sentences what the system needs to do for the user. The purpose of the story, the purpose of user story, is to provide a basis for managing and organizing and estimating the development, replace the need for really detailed formal requirement specifications. User stories are usually very terse, and they drive the creation of automated acceptance tests, which can be used for downstream regression purposes. When it comes time to implement the story, we will probably need a lot more details from the customer or from the user or from the business stakeholders. And we get these details in Agile teams when we actually implement the story. So the user story of the style that we're talking about here are often attributed to a guy called Mike Cohen, who wrote a book, User Stories Applied, and I often call them Cohen-style user stories, because they always have the element, who is the user, what does the user want to do, and why? Who is the user, what do they want to do, and why? So that's the 3 questions that a user story answers, right? Who is the user, what do they want to do, and to what benefit, to what end, why? And please, please, please don't forget the why. That helps a lot. Some of the best tests of a story are related to demonstrating that we achieved the why. User story tests provide examples. of different scenarios to confirm our understanding of typical, alternative, and error situations which a user may encounter. Now, this is important to note that we use the term examples here. It complements the requirements. If you were to interview a non-technical stakeholder about acceptance criterion for a project, they might be hard-pressed to answer the question, what is an acceptance test for this requirement? But they're usually able to share with you examples of how the system should behave in different circumstances. So your job, in a sense, is to identify the circumstances and interview the customer or interview the stakeholder about how the system should behave. And then when we actually run these tests, we'll confirm very specifically that that's what happens. Indeed, there's languages that have been invented to facilitate this, which we'll look at in the test automation part of this course. One of them is called Gherkin. And Gherkin is a sort of a scripting language that makes it really easy to describe in non-technical terms the interaction between the user and the system to get things done, one acceptance criterion at a time, one story test at a time. Story testing. So for a user story, it's usually practical to take a look at it from the point of view of scenarios. In other words, think of the story and an example of someone achieving success or trying to achieve success in the story and maybe failing. And the type of scenarios we're looking for here are usually of three types. There might be more in some cases, and I'm just talking about functional stuff right now. There's also possibility you can have non-functional acceptance criterion too, like performance criterion, security criterion, etc. But for the functional testing, we would normally collect normal scenarios, alternate scenarios, and error scenarios. These are three types of scenarios that we would collect about the story. So we want an example. Give me a normal example, alternate, and error examples. So a normal example or a normal scenario or normal flow is a scenario which is a typical example of the user completing the story with a positive outcome. Let's say you're buying a book on Amazon.com. The story is, as a member of the book buying public, I want to buy a book on Amazon.com so I can read it in a few days. So that's a user story in the Mike Cohen style. Who is the user? What do you want to do and why? So a member of the book buying public wants to buy a book so they can read it in a few days. A normal flow might be to buy a book online that exists in inventory with user credentials that are valid and a valid payment term. So that would be a normal flow, a typical flow. Buy the book based on the title. It's a clear example of what we need the product to do. That's a normal flow. Usually you're looking for something here that is the most common, something that will happen frequently or that you anticipate will be common. Notice I didn't say the happy path, I said normal path. Don't think of happy path. Happy path is the path when everything goes right. Normal is the most common one. I want to talk about common. Now, alternate flows are other ways to achieve success. So there's scenarios, still examples of the user completing the story with a positive outcome. They succeed, but there was some variation in the path to achieve the objective due to differences in, and it says date, but it's usually data, system state, or other factors. So alternate flows help to explore the many different ways a user can accomplish the story. If we detail alternate flows, we have a better understanding of the amount of effort and work required to actually implement a story. Alternate flows really help us understand the scope of work required in implementing and testing an agile story. For the Amazon case, the normal flow, I bought a book that was in inventory based on the title. An alternate flow might be, I'm going to buy a book that's in inventory based on the ISBN number, or another one. I'm going to buy a book based on the author's name, or I'm going to buy a book based on the subject, or I'm going to buy a book based on some special offer I was given. So there's all sorts of different ways someone can arrive at buying a book. Those are alternate flows. Now look, I'm not talking about the GUI, the user interface. I'm not saying pull down menus instead of hit buttons. That's not what I mean by alternate flows. I'm talking about the business flow, the transaction flow, the business steps you're going through, not the user interface steps. Okay, so this is basically alternate flow, different steps to achieve success. Now, the last type of flow that we elicit for stories would be called error flows. And error flows are still scenarios, they're still examples which the user does not succeed. They're all alternates in which something has gone wrong or for some reason we cannot succeed. For example, we have invalid data or an inappropriate system state. Error flows help people understand a lot about the type of error handling that's expected, at least from a business perspective here. Now, this is talking about errors based on things the user brings to the table. We are not talking about failure modes here. So this is not the errors like the network goes down in the middle of a transaction. What should we do? That's not something the user brings with them. That depends on the design. The error flows here depend on the requirements, the business rules, what's required by the user, not necessarily the implementation. So if you run out of disk space, yes, that's an interesting thing we probably want to test on the sprint, but that's not really an error flow. That depends on the implementation. So if we do it without a disk, well, it doesn't matter. What's the disk space matter? So we have to be careful to separate this. These are errors related to what's required, not necessarily errors related to how the system is designed or implemented. So we understand these error flows. We get a very good handle on how to build the system, and I get a very complete view. So for a user story, we'll grab normal flows, alternate flows, and error flows. There's almost always at least one normal flow for a story. The number of alternate and error flows may vary dramatically. Just to give you a few examples here, this is one from an old online DVD rental story. This probably should be modernized to be for an online movie streaming service, but right now this is Webflix, predates Netflix, a testing example of a company that rents DVDs online. So the story we're picking here is basically, as a Webflix member, I would like to rent a DVD online so I can watch it in a few days. So DVD, watch it in a few days, makes perfect sense. Now, if we look at, and this is a visualization I like to use for story tests, when I'm collecting them, to put it in the map like this, makes it very easy to elicit them from people and not bother them with too much unnecessary detail. So the story center node says, rent a DVD. So that's the name of the story. And the normal flow would be, okay, well, we want to rent a valid DVD that's in inventory based on title. An alternate flow might be, well, okay, we try to rent a valid DVD, but it's based instead on genre, or based on a partial match of a title, or based on the actors, or based on the director. All of these flows, by the way, dramatically change the complexity of the story. If you, for example, need to rent by genre, then you need to have something in your database that shows the relationship between movies and genre, or you need to have access to a service outside like IMDb online services to basically share that information. The complexity of implementing and testing a story changes dramatically with the alternate flows. So that's for the DVD rental. Error flows that are enumerated here are ones that are in the responsibility of the user and that were important when we elicited them from the customer. Excuse the spelling here. So error, valid title, but not in inventory. So we don't have it, but yes, it's a real movie. It's a valid title, but it's not an inventory. Where we have an invalid title. So someone's trying to rent a DVD with a title that is not an appropriate title, or it's not a real title, or it's not maybe coded right. User account not valid. User account in bad standing. So they owe us money, or the account's just not right. There's something it isn't an account. And then we have, if we're renting by the different genres, well, invalid actors, directors, actors, directors, genre, all that could be invalid. And there's also the possibility of a timeout where a user takes too much time to complete a transaction. So that's an example of the type of detail that we might get when we elicit this from the customer. Now, as we implement it, we may need more detail, so we want to talk to them as we're implementing it. But this is, for me, this is fine level of detail for collecting and having very a good idea is what we're going to implement. So this is my like design visualization for this, for the story tests. And it's easy for non-technical stakeholders, I think, to get a feel for what the complexity of what we're doing is by looking at this visualization. Also, if the story is too big and it doesn't fit reasonably within a sprint, looking at the flows like this with the acceptance tests helps us to see how we might want to take that story and split it up so it better fits in the increment we're using to develop it. Other examples, so there's Webflix, there's consumer stories, for example, registering a new user, adding a DVD, or changing a credit card, and inventory management stories, receiving a new DVD, shipping a DVD, or adjusting a DVDs. And we can go through them. I don't have the statement of the stories, but you can imagine as a consumer, I want to register as a new user so that I'll be able to rent DVDs online. So the normal flow would be, so there's a valid client with good credit in country. So this is domestic. Then we have alternate, well, a valid client, good credit, but international from a country in our accepted country list. And then that means countries we can ship to and do transactions with. Error flow would be things like valid client data, good credit, but unacceptable country, or valid client, poor credit in country, or valid client, poor credit in an acceptable foreign country, or valid client, poor credit, unacceptable foreign country, or invalid client data. These are all examples of the error flows, and in them, we may also want to come up with details about what is the expected outcome. That's also something I might want to elicit too from my stakeholders. So what is the expected outcome? If we have invalid data, do we want to give an error message, or do we want to try to pre-populate a field or grab it from these days from Facebook or something like that? Whatever the customer wants. For the story, adding a DVD to a rental list, normal flow, the DVD's in catalog and in inventory. Alternate, it's in catalog but not in inventory. Error, it's not in catalog. So this is, they're choosing something to rent from a catalog, but it's not available to be rented. Changing credit cards, this is something that we expect is going to happen frequently for many reasons. So normal flow, they use the same credit card number, but with a new date. And so this is most common case, the normal flow. Alternate, well, they have a new credit card, and then error flows, invalid card type, invalid number, invalid expiry date, same as previous number, but not acceptable to the bank, and invalidated for some reason by the banking service. Now, this is interesting. When you work at a company, I spent time at Visa, for example, and they will have miles and miles of examples of error flows for credit card numbers. The thing is, you want to talk about this with your customer, because this may apply also to many, many, many stories or many circumstances. What do we do if the credit card has some sort of problem with it when they try to change credit card? An interesting thing, but you might have to go through that analysis once and then you can reuse it many, many times, or there may be some company standards that you can apply to. So error flow might just be apply company business rules to that case. Let's see, receiving a DVD in inventory. So the normal flow, we grab it from the supplier, it's already in the catalog, we add it to inventory, we get it, but we have to add it to both the catalog and to inventory, or it doesn't match something and we can't put it anywhere because it's not in either our catalog or inventory, they sent us the wrong DVD. Shipping it to client, normal flow, the DVD is in the catalog and shipped to a valid client address. Alternate, it's ordered by catalog and returned from another client, is shipped to valid, just returned and shipped to valid address. So it's basically something that's been received, but it wasn't put back in inventory. And the last one is ordered by client in catalog and just returned and is shipped to invalid address. So we have some sort of error condition in there. And the last one on this list, adjusting inventory for lost DVDs. So we basically, inventory count dropped. This is normal flow, no reorder since it is not a DVD rental list of another client. And alternate, we drop the inventory, we trigger a reorder because someone else wants to rent the DVD. So we have very few cases for that. You notice there's no error flows for that one. And one last one here, just to go into a more complicated set of business rules. If you've ever played the children's board game or the adult board game, Monopoly, people started this at 8 years old. It's an amazingly complex game. So I've actually put together a complete descriptions of the Monopoly game using Cohen-style user stories and with each and every story having associated acceptance criteria to it. So just to show you one example from Monopoly of what acceptance tests might look like for a story. So story tests might look like this. Imagine you're playing Monopoly and it's time to buy a house. So you want to purchase a house. So as a game player, I want to purchase a house for a specific property so that I can profit from increased rent revenue. So that's who's the user, what do they want to do and why. Makes sense right from the game of Monopoly. The normal flow is the case where the player owns the colors, the bank has available houses, a player has sufficient money, the houses are balanced, and there's no auction required. So that's the normal flow. Alternate flow, the player owns the color group, the bank has available houses, the player has sufficient funds, the houses are balanced, but we're going to do an auction because multiple people want to buy that house at the same time. And various airflows could be you don't own the color group, the houses aren't balanced, there's a shortage of houses, there's not enough to buy, insufficient money, lost the auction. A property already has the maximum number of houses, so you can't add houses to it, and the property might not be a color group. You can't put a house on a railroad, for example. So that's just a collection of some examples from different stories. We are collecting normal flows, alternate flows, and air flows. We elicit them, describe them, and then we will take these and turn them into tests. We'll probably turn them into automated tests using the Gherkin scripting method, and then put that as part of our regression tests. But we definitely want to be able to make sure that when we elicit and describe these tests, that it's something that both technical and non-technical stakeholders understand, and that the programmers know about these acceptance tests before they start implementing the feature, because the story test is in fact part of the requirements. It is not just a regression test or an acceptance test. It's a really very important part of the requirements. So thank you very much.